We go live on.
Thank you, Senator. We are live.
All right, good morning. It is January 23rd. We are back in Senate Judiciary for what is presumably the final hearing for Mr. Drescher. We have a line of witnesses who've come here to testify, some in person, some on Zoom. First we have is Joseph Corellis, and if you want to introduce yourself and describe how you know Mr. Drescher, and then Corellis.
And I do have extra hard copies of the letter I submitted, if anyone would like one. Yeah. Oops. Okay. Oh, there we go. Thank you. You need one? Joe Corella, Huntington, Vermont. I know I've worked for DOJ for almost 32 years, almost 27 in the U.S. Attorney's Office and mostly in Burlington, but Rutland office too, and basically overlapped with Mike Drescher for all but 2 years of his tenure there, so a couple of decades. So know him well and got to observe him in action in court and witness interviews and internal meetings and discussions. And but I want to go into that a little more, obviously, but I appreciate the opportunity to testify here. And it's not often I get to come to the State House. It's such an inspiring building, much more inspiring than the rather bland Burlington courthouse. And one of the downsides of federal practice is you don't get to very often go into the incredible state courthouses and buildings. So thank you. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where they stand in moments of comfort and convenience, but where they stand at times of challenge and controversy." Mike Drescher faced a time of challenge and controversy in the first several months of the Trump administration. Proof very disturbing to, I think, most all DOJ alums and probably many current folks that aren't able to be as outspoken about it. Instead of resigning, Mike Drescher rose to the occasion, rose to the controversy at sacrifice. He put his staff, he put the Department of Justice, he put the state of Vermont above everyone else at sacrifice to him. As I see now, he's coming under very unfair attack, mostly from form emails, form letters. I call them uninformed letters, people that don't know him. But those of us that know him, particularly those outside of the office, there's a special camaraderie for not only federal prosecutors, paralegals, anyone that has worked in that office. We are so dedicated to that mission. We're so concerned about the office's credibility, reputation, its mission. I think I can represent for everyone. We were relieved Mike was at the helm there, showing leadership. And I know, talking informally to staff, they were so impressed with Mike's leadership. That should not count against him by people that don't help him. A little bit more about my background, because it's not about me, but I think it's important to know that I have quite a deep history in Vermont and the Vermont court system. Went to Vermont Law School, graduated in 1988, decades after Emory graduated from there. Clerked for Judge Billings, Franklin S. Billings, Speaker of the House here, as you all know, in the mid-60s during reapportionment. Got to hear lots of stories about the Vermont Judiciary, Vermont history, the Vermont House, and one of the ones that stuck in mind, very short. Judge Billings once said when he was Speaker of the House, there was a gentleman from the kingdom that said, Speaker Billings, you vote with me on deer, I'll vote with you on everything else. And Billings said, deal. He was short and to the point. But when I worked for Judge Billings, I was very, was basically enlightened that the U.S. Attorney's Office was where I was the dream job, where I wanted to work. You pursued justice, you pursued fairness, you showed empathy to even most people you were prosecuting, and those values were instilled in me. And I saw those values in Mike Drescher. He has a strong sense of empathy and fairness, and his integrity and intellect cannot be questioned. I've sat in witness interviews of drug addicts in recovery that are struggling, and you can't help. People often think prosecutors are robots, everything's black and white. And as anyone who has worked in law enforcement knows, it's not all black and white. And you are sometimes distraught at the circumstances people find themselves in. You may have a witness or a defendant that's their parents, maybe even their grandparents were struggling drug addicts or prior felonies, and you think, what chance did they have? And you have to weigh the public interest, public safety, versus those mitigating factors. And Mike was so astute about that. Another area I'd like to focus on is the recovery court. And I was, from the inception, which Chris Coffin supported the founding of it in his last year of U.S. attorney, but it was a pretty unusual, at that time, unusual program. It was pretty common in state court. Vermont state courts have had it, but the whole concept of giving addiction defendants an opportunity to either earn no jail sentence or even get misdemeanors there were prosecutors that were resistant about that. Mike embraced it fully, as did Christina Nolan, who I equally support. Although I recognize this hearing is about Michael Drescher. And I think that all those qualities, there's overlapping qualities between what's a good prosecutor and what's a good judge. You have to focus on facts, law. You also have to take into account empathy and a sense of fairness and justice. And Mr. Drescher would focus intensely on all those issues, and it has always impressed me. I think most telling, I hope, the Senate of these committee hearings. This is the first one I've ever appeared with. It's somewhat quasi-judicial. You weigh credibility of witnesses, you give different weight to witnesses. It seems like everybody who has personal knowledge of Michael Drescher fully supports him, fully supports his integrity, his sense of fairness, his intellect. And from what I've read, perhaps all the opposition has come from people that don't really know Mike. So I encourage and hope the committee will approve his nomination. Thank you for your time. Any questions?
Yes, sir.
I do have a question. Your first sentence strikes me very powerfully, the Martin Luther King Jr. quote. The ultimate measure is where they stand at times of challenge and controversy. So one of the problems for me in thinking about this is the Muslim Dawud case. So as you frame it here, you say, instead of resigning, which would have been the easier path, and you described what was happening as disturbing. And I agree. I think those prosecutions were disturbing, and they were kind of the tip of the spear for what we're seeing broader across the country now. But you say it would have been easier to resign, but he rose to the occasion and put the staff of the attorney's office in the state of Vermont about his own interests. But to somebody who comes at it from the opposite perspective on that prosecution, it seems as though what you're saying is, by doing exactly what the people driving the disturbing prosecutions wanted, he was putting everyone's interests where they needed to be. In other words, his actions would be indistinguishable from somebody who was simply following orders from. So I have a difficult time seeing going along with the disturbing prosecution, moving to keep those people in custody and detention on the, chance that they could be spirited out of the country to perhaps a place in Central or Southern America or Africa. So I know, as someone who knows him and who respects him, that strikes you as an act of courage. But to me, I'm wondering, how does it differ from somebody who just would be taking orders and going along with the disturbing prosecution? The actions are the same in either case, if you see what I'm saying.
I think there's nuances. I wasn't at those hearings. My understanding is Mr. Drescher focused on narrow jurisdictional issues. He did not misstate the facts. And in that situation, and Mr. Drescher will, if he hasn't already, speak to this, but my opinion, he likely weighed all those things, and there was a trust in the court system and trust in our federal judges. And someone from our office needed to stand up in court. I do not think a slew of resignations from the office would have been helpful to the pursuit of broader justice in Vermont. And so there are nuances. I realize that these cases were distasteful. Sure, if Michael Drescher had his preference, he wouldn't take them, but someone had to take them. And I think it's my final point. I think you have to look at the manner in which he took them. He did not fully embrace the rhetoric that was coming out of DC. He did not embrace it at all for my readings of the account. And it's probably unfortunate that these cases are still pending, because I think the judges could speak to his integrity in these cases and the difficult position he was put in. And I realize you're saying there's a victim here, but there's a bigger picture. And ultimately, I believe Mr. Drescher trusted the judicial system. He wasn't the last line of defense here. And does that answer your question, even though you may disagree?
I find it responsive.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing. Long-winded, but responsive.
I hear you saying that you trusted the judicial system, and I wonder if you feel like the people who were being held, frankly, in my view, in violation of our Constitution, because it was for retaliation for exercising their First Amendment rights, if they feel they can trust the judicial system, or if the public feels that in that moment that was a trustworthy action.
I will let Mr. Drescher speak to most of that, but there have been cases won and lost. And I think at times the interviews I saw, they were thankful of the judicial system, but I don't have any knowledge of the personal thoughts. But I think generally, the courts are holding. Not every case that people, would like, but I think there is three co-equal branches of government and the court is taking that seriously.
Let me actually rephrase the question. If it were you being held for for exercising your First Amendment rights, and someone argued that you should continue to be held for exercising those rights, would that feel just to you?
Of course not, but I would also have faith that my rights would be vindicated through the judicial system and firmly believe in that. And, ultimately the Article 3 judges are a check on the executive branch. And this was a delicate situation. And I trusted, and he'll speak to this, the judicial branch to do its job. And I think you should look again at how he conducted himself in this hearing, and whether he did so credibly or not. And I find myself, there are times that people can argue the stances of the U.S. Attorney's Office is unjust. There's no question about it, but and I've disagreed with what justice, you pursue justice, that's your intent, but that's kind of amorphous at times. So.
Thank you. Committee, any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Ross.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Next up, we have Owen Foster.
Morning. My name is Owen Foster. I'm the chair of the Executive Mountain Care Board, the state health care regulator. I'd like to thank the chair and the committee for making time for me to speak today. Prior to my appointment at Green Mountain Care Board, I was an assistant United States attorney for the District of Vermont, and at that office, I was a healthcare fraud coordinator, also an ethics officer, and professional responsibility officer for the office. As a healthcare fraud coordinator, I led investigations across the country, and as the ethics officer, professional responsibility officer, it's my job to make sure that the assistant U.S. attorneys comply with all ethical obligations. I was a colleague to both Supreme Court nominees for many years. Later, Ms. Nolan was appointed by the president to be the U.S. attorney, and she was my boss. Both are highly competent, ethical lawyers with extensive experience that make them well qualified to serve as associate justices on our Supreme Court. My comments today will focus on Mr. Drescher's nomination, as I've observed some of the hearings and learned of the advocacy campaign against the appointment. Based on my personal experience and observations, I believe that many of the letters against Mr. Drescher's appointment lacked an understanding of how the U.S. Attorney's Office works and seem to inaccurately paint him as something that he is not. I'm hoping my testimony today provides you important context and accurate facts on which to exercise your obligation to provide advice and consent on Mr. Drescher's appointment. Much of the opposition to Mr. Drescher's appointment stems from two cases he did in a 24-year career in the U.S. Attorney's Office. I want to tell you about a couple other cases, if you will. Around 2018, I discovered a kickback scheme between an electronic medical record company and Purdue Pharma. Purdue Pharma is an opioid manufacturer and made the product OxyContin that led to rampant addiction across the United States of America. It was an important and complex case, and I needed the U.S. attorney to assign one of our best prosecutors. I went to the U.S. attorney, Ms. Nolan, and said, please give me our best. And she did. She gave me blood pressure. For 2 years, Mr. Drescher and I traveled around the country, taking testimony, reviewing documents, and building up the criminal case. Mr. Drescher was a remarkable partner. He's not only one of the most talented lawyers I've ever worked with, but he has immense integrity. He's incredibly upstanding. If there were ever a gray area on how to handle an issue, Mike would always take the conservative side and make sure that the defendant got a fair shake. His tenacity led to an enormous recovery, criminal accountability of a key executive, and ultimately resulted in billions of dollars of recovery and tons of money to the state of Vermont through the bankruptcy process that was enabled to our resolution of the Purdue Pharma case. Mike also led many other significant cases that were critical to public safety in the state of Vermont, including violent crimes, murder, and cases of sexual assault against young children. He prosecuted John Griffin, a CNN producer, who was luring and grooming children at his Okemo ski house. It's important to know that Mike also was a strong advocate for drug recovery programs. He's not a right-wing zealot. He really believed in those programs and stood up for them. He also supported our other civil rights work, and as the acting U.S. attorney, oversaw the investigation and resolution of an Americans with Disabilities Act violation by a Vermont hospital recently. I do want to speak briefly to Mike's demeanor and interpersonal relationships. Mike worked well with everyone in the office, with the court, with defense counsel, with defendants, and with everyone with whom he interacted. When cancer struck a couple families in the office, it was Mike that organized a meal train and gift cards for the families. I understand some are concerned about Mike's politics because of his role as the acting U.S. attorney under the current administration and his handling of those two defensive immigration matters. I'd like to address both. First, Mike was not appointed by President Trump. He was elevated to be the first assistant U.S. attorney under the Biden administration. Cole Harris, who I think is going to speak later today, was appointed by President Biden. He selected personally Mike to be his first assistant, essentially his deputy. Mike did not apply to be the U.S. attorney under President Trump. He did not. He did, however, apply for a presidential appointment under President Biden. Mike was a finalist for the U.S. District Court judgeship, the federal judgeship, that was appointed under President Biden, and it was led by Senators Sanders and Welch. So I think there has been a misconception because of his role as the acting U.S. attorney by some people who are voicing opposition that they have concerns that he's a Trump person and they don't agree with the Trump politics. But that's actually inaccurate. Second, U.S. Attorney's Office did not have an option not to defend the immigration cases that have been brought up. It's important to know that they were not prosecutions. There is no prosecutorial discretion. Somebody has to go into court on those cases. There's no option not to. So if Mike had not done the cases, somebody else would have done the cases. And if Mike were to resign, somebody else would have been appointed. I don't know that from the perspective of people who are concerned about his appointment, it would have been ultimately better for Mike to resign and have a political person appointed. I think that's an important distinction. I think when we're talking about these issues, we're really narrowly focused on this one situation, where there's actually a bigger and broader picture, where we have a really talented, apolitical career public servant who's worked across many, many administrations, no politics. And now he's being attacked for politics, which he never had. And if we think about the precedent, do we really want our apolitical public servants resigning if they don't like the current administration or current administration's views? Let's take it a different way. Let's say in this example, rather than Mr. Drescher, it was a Democrat, and it was a Democrat following a Democratic president's prerogatives. When the president changes, DOJ's priorities have to change. That's what the president's allowed to do. They put in their U.S. attorney, they put in their attorney general, and they change the priorities. It happens all the time. So every time there's a switch, do we actually want the apolitical career public servants to resign or to not do the cases? I think that's a really bad precedent. If we had a Democrat, would the Republicans vote against that person because they found the Democratic priorities objectionable? I don't think that's a good approach. I recognize you've received considerable constituent outreach, but I do want to highlight that there's been a number of people who supported Mr. Drescher's confirmation, including the federal public defender. Many of the letters you received, as Mr. Prella pointed out, were not from people who've ever had a case with Mike or ever worked with him or ever even known him. Federal public defender is a primary adversary to the U.S. Attorney's Office. We do cases against them. Mr. Destel has been there many, many years, and he submitted a letter with firsthand knowledge opposing Mr. Drescher in numerous cases. To have your primary adversary submit a public letter in support of your appointment speaks volumes, and in my opinion, should receive far more weight than a series of template letters sourced from people who never had a case with Mike. Now, quote, Mr. Destel. He found Mr. Drescher to be intelligent, honest, fair, full of integrity, and consistently directed to results that achieve justice. And, quote, one of the opposing attorneys for whom I have the highest regard and respect. Everyone who's worked with Mike Drescher, for, against, with, believes the exact same thing. I strongly urge you to confirm Mr. Drescher. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. One question. You mentioned the federal judge position, when was that?
It was at the tail end of the Biden administration. Judge Lanphier ultimately received the position. There's public reports of the finalists, and Mr. Drescher was identified in those public articles as one of the finalists for that position.
And I guess more of a comment. I mean, I guess for me, one of the issues is not, you know, why didn't Mr. Drescher resign or just ignore the case and then have it go to somebody else in the office? The question that I've been grappling with over the last few weeks now at this point is the response and the position that was taken, and the arguments presented, which were for the purposes of vindicating the detention of these two individuals. So there isn't a question in there, but that is one of the pieces that's a challenge for me here.
I understand, and I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office when these cases were brought, and it is important to remember, though, they are civil defensive cases, and ultimately the defendants prevailed. The plaintiffs actually rather prevailed in those matters. If Mr. Drescher had not taken the cases and somebody else had, the arguments may have been more strident.
Do you have your?
I did, and mine is also a bit more of a comment, but maybe there's a question at the end. I have spoken to people who do and know and have worked with or experienced Mr. Drescher who are not in support, but they are afraid to put their name on the record because they fear retribution. That to me is telling in and of itself. And I don't know if you have any response to that, but that hurts my heart to hear people saying, I don't feel like I can come forward.
I would agree that it's unfortunate if you feel that they're unsafe to come forward. Certainly, Supreme Court justice is a very powerful position. I can understand that feeling. I would be very surprised if they, the basis for being concerned as to Mr. Drescher having retribution towards anyone that's completely out of character. I had observed him and worked with him, with defendants, incredibly fair, incredibly empathetic. I mean, his primary adversary from the U.S. Attorney's Office submitted a strong letter report. It would be very out of character for him to have any sort of negative relationships with him.
I have my own comment, but just on that one, I don't think necessarily it's Mr. Drescher that people are afraid of. They're afraid of putting their name on the record because these days, one's name in the record can lead unexpectedly to being sued, indicted, etc. So, and again, this is a comment, not so much a question, but the first Trump administration, there was a widespread rationalization among people who retained their jobs in that administration, that it was better for them to be there than to step down and have someone worse. And I'm fully of the opinion that it gets worse and worse with the Trump administration. So his second term, he came in, put in people that my mind still boggles that they are wielding the authority that they're wielding. With that said, again, how is one to distinguish between a good person who's staying in there to prevent the office from going to a bad person? So they're going to forward the disturbing actions of the administration rather than someone else forwarding them. I feel in my own mind, logically, and in my own heart, that there is a moment where cooperation is simply no longer viable. And that's, I think, the question for me in these cases. Ms. Oster and Mr. Medalli, they were high profile on purpose, meant to chill activism, meant to send a message to college campuses and faculty across the country, in the case of Mr. Medalli. So that's what I struggle with, is testimony from people who know Michael Drescher. My experience of his testimony is that he's a very nice person. But back to that quote from Martin Luther King Jr., where are they at times of challenge and controversy? I find it hard in this particular moment to limit my consideration to somebody needed to be there and he was protecting a junior subordinate. So that is something I'm considering, and I'm glad to have your input.
I think it's an excellent question. How do you distinguish someone who's actually advocating for these policies that you may find objectionable and somebody who's there to do the right thing? And I think what I'd recommend is you look at the totality of their work and their experience and their character. Right? So first, look at all of Mr. Drescher's record. Is this a history of these kinds of cases and this kind of ethos? No, it's not. He's advocated for civil rights cases. He's advocated for drug recovery programs. He's advocated for white collar criminals being held accountable. The record that you have before you is not one of somebody who's dyed in the wool on the policies that you may find objectionable, right? That's not what you have before you in the totality of this experience. Second, I would look towards the people who have worked with him and who vouched for his character. And then third, if he really was of the stripe that you're concerned about, would he have applied to be the Trump U.S. attorney? And would he have, and also keep in mind the context, these were civil defensive cases. They were not cases where he could have said, we're choosing not to prosecute. I think that is a really, really important distinction. If you look at the case the U.S. Attorney's Office did, they were not out very affirmatively pursuing criminal immigration cases when the administration changed. That was under Mr. Drescher's leadership. So you have two cases, civil defensive. You do not have the huge glut of cases affirmative criminal prosecution that they were choosing to take up. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. So if you're trying to draw that distinction, was he going along to do the right thing in your mind, or was he going along because he was in alignment with all these policies? I'd consider those things.
Senator Robles,
I guess my question to that is if one is going along with arguably unconstitutional actions, does it matter if it's because they agree or because they don't? Like, does the intent matter if the ultimate action is they're going along with it?
So I think sometimes when they say constitutional, unconstitutional, it's not always as black and white as it may seem. There are tons of cases in district court and the Second Circuit where they go both ways. What is constitutional is not always a bright line. I'm not talking about these cases in particular, just in general. And again, I'd go back to focusing on these two cases or the bigger picture and the long game. If he had resigned or had not taken the cases, an appointment would have been made. And I'm not sure if that ultimately that would have been consistent with what you would perceive as the right way to do it. The cases would not have gone away.
Senator Matos, Senator Morris, what was happening? All right, thank you.
Thank you very much for your time.
Next up, we have Nicholas Carest. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing the last name.
That's fine. It's Nicholas Karist, and I go by Colo, but it's good to be here. Thank you. Good morning, senators. Thank you for the opportunity to speak in support of Michael Drescher's nomination to the Vermont Supreme Court. And thank you very much for allowing me to appear remotely. I've prepared a statement. I'm also happy to try to answer any of your questions at the end. I recognize that some of the things I will say you've heard already, and I suspect you will hear again. But I think that I do offer somewhat of a unique perspective on this, given my interactions with Mike over the years. So my name is Nicholas Karist. I'll give you a little bit about my background. I moved to Vermont from Maine in 2010 to join the U.S. Attorney's Office. I was a career assistant U.S. attorney in Vermont from 2010 to 2021. From 2010 to 2019, I had various roles in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the civil division. I was the civil rights coordinator and I was the civil chief. From 2019 to 2021, I moved to the criminal division of the U.S. Attorney's Office where I was a federal prosecutor. In the fall of 2021, President Biden nominated me to be the United States Attorney for the District of Vermont. I was confirmed by the U.S. Senate and took office in late 2021. I was U.S. Attorney until January 20th, 2025, when the Biden administration ended. Now I'm a partner at the law firm of Striss and Maher. And I'm here today to offer my strongest support for Michael Drescher's candidacy to be a justice of the Vermont Supreme Court. I've known Mike since late 2009 when he interviewed me to be an assistant U.S. attorney in the civil division of the U.S. Attorney's Office. In my opinion, Mike is an ideal fit to take the bench because of his intellect, his temperament, and his experience. I'll give you some details on Mike's qualifications. He's litigated complex civil defensive cases, affirmative civil fraud matters, and prosecuted countless criminal cases. As a result of Mike's experience and his reputation, junior lawyers at the U.S. Attorney's Office regularly sought out Mike's advice on how to handle complicated matters in both civil and criminal cases. Mike is the kind of lawyer who methodically assesses each case that crosses his desk, not leaping to conclusions, letting the facts and the law lead the way. Mike is also an excellent explainer of legal concepts and often demonstrated this quality during training sessions in the U.S. Attorney's Office. There is no doubt in my mind that his demeanor and his intelligence would be welcome on the bench. As Mr. Foster noted, Mike is also recognized by the defense bar as a fair and zealous advocate. He understands and values the collegiality that makes Vermont practice special. And as Mr. Foster did, I specifically refer you to the letter of the former federal public defender, Mike Desautels. Mike Drescher recognizes the deep significance of the cases that he handled as an assistant U.S. attorney. I know this as a fact because Mike talked with me and his colleagues about the life-changing events that happen daily in the courtrooms of Vermont. As a small but significant gesture of this awareness, I have often seen Mike take a moment to offer best wishes to defendants at the conclusion of their cases. These interactions in the courtroom, which last all but a few seconds, speak volumes about the person Mike is and his awareness of the impact of the choices made by prosecutors and the court. If you spend any time in the courtrooms of Vermont, you know that this kind of gesture that Mike made a habit of is unusual and is emblematic of his humanity and the person that he is. 13 years after I joined the U.S. Attorney's Office, I had the good fortune to lead that great office and its team of unmatched public servants. When I needed to appoint a first assistant, the number 2 in the office, a confidant and a counselor for me, and a chief operating officer for the whole office, I asked Mike to take on that role. Fortunately for me, and even more fortunately for the office team, Mike said yes. I was honored to have Mike as my deputy, and he performed that role with distinction while I was still in the office. As examples of Mike's dedication and excellence, when there were budget impasses and threats of government shutdowns, I recall Mike going door to door to try to assuage people's concerns, especially the people new to federal service. I also have strong memories of Mike joining me on visits to the Islamic Society of Vermont in South Burlington, where he made connections of his own and helped explain federal civil rights law to the members of the mosque. After President Biden lost the election, I knew I'd be leaving, as is the normal course for presidentially appointed U.S. Senate confirmed U.S. attorneys, when there is a party change in the White House. On my last day in the U.S. Attorney's Office, last January 17th, almost exactly 1 year ago, I wished Mike and the office regular days in the years to come. None of us could have imagined how few regular days there have been in the past year. Instead of regular days pursuing justice, career public servants at the Department of Justice and in the U.S. Attorney's offices around the country have been under siege. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Vermont, under Mike Drescher's leadership, has been no exception. Many public servants, dedicated public servants at the U.S. Attorney's Office and elsewhere in the Department of Justice have debated leaving behind their dream jobs due to the pressures imposed by this administration. They've heard friends and family and community members say, "It's important for you to stay. We need good people like you to remain and protect our treasured institutions." Mike was one of those people who chose to remain and do his best to protect the best traditions of the Department of Justice and our local U.S. Attorney's Office. In the past year, Mike's leadership of that office was nothing short of heroic. At every turn, Mike has prioritized the office and the rank and file career public servants over his personal comfort and his day-to-day stability. To put a fine point on it, Mike has demonstrated an extreme level of sacrifice over the past year. Mike has done whatever it takes to keep the U.S. Attorney's Office functioning and serving its incredibly important role of protecting public safety in Vermont. On a day-to-day level, this meant doing things that under normal circumstances would have never happened, and none of us who have worked at DOJ could have ever imagined. And this includes representation of the United States in response to habeas petitions where the circumstances of arrest are beyond the pale, contrary to anything we'd seen before, and in violation of basic First Amendment principles. From that lens, some may ask, why would Mike Drescher stand up in court and make arguments that to the outside observer seem supportive of those horrible arrests? Based on my experience in the U.S. Attorney's Office as civil chief and then U.S. Attorney, and my familiarity with Mike's leadership, I can offer a couple of reasons for your consideration. First, there was no good answer for Mike or the U.S. Attorney's Office when those cases came in the door. There was no discretion not to deal with them. These are not criminal cases where there is prosecutorial discretion. There's no prosecution in these cases. They're civil cases. And second, in this administration, in civil cases like this, there's no discretion to say, no, thank you, we'd prefer not to handle this case without suffering dire consequences to your career and the careers of those around you. Once a civil case is assigned to the office, there's a duty to handle that case in an ethical manner, making reasonable legal arguments. Mike had no good options to choose from. In fact, I believe there were 4 bad options for Mike when these habeas petitions were filed in Vermont. Before I describe those 4 options, I'd like to focus a little more on the role that Mike filled after I left the office and until he recently resigned. Mike took over the leadership of the U.S. Attorney's Office by operation of statute, not because he was chosen by the current administration or as a so-called Trump U.S. Attorney. Mike Drescher never was and never will be a Trump U.S. Attorney. He took over leadership of the office because he was the first assistant when I resigned about 1 year ago. Full stop. Unlike me, a President Biden nominee or other U.S. attorneys around the country who actually have been nominated by President Trump, it's incorrect to put the label of any president or political party on Mike Drescher. Turning back to Mike's 4 bad options when the Ozturk and Madawi habeas petitions were filed in the District of Vermont. One was to assign the cases to someone else in the office. That would have been the normal course. It's highly unusual for the leader of the office to stand up in court and take full responsibility for a civil case like this. But this isn't Mike's leadership style or how he approached the last year. He's repeatedly taken the least desirable assignments for himself, and this was definitely no exception. A second bad option was to contact the DOJ leadership in DC at the highest levels and say that the office would prefer not to handle the cases. This would have led to two things happening. One is that Mike almost certainly would have been fired. Fall in line or get fired is an explicit message from the current DOJ leadership, and we all know that the current DOJ administration has followed through on that threat numerous times. Two, the cases weren't going away, so Mike's firing would have led to someone else in the office having to face the same impossible quandary, or it would have led to DOJ leadership sending a Trump loyalist to Vermont to handle the cases. A third option would have been to resign in protest of the circumstances of the arrests and the irregular nature of these cases. If Mike had made this choice, it would have resulted in the same outcomes as telling DOJ leadership, no thanks to the cases. What would have followed would have been almost certainly an office in turmoil without its leader and likely a fervent supporter of this administration's tactics arriving from DC to argue the cases. The fourth option was what Mike did. Take the heat himself to prevent others in the office from having to do so, or to prevent a politically motivated advocate being sent from DC to handle the cases. I know Mike wishes the circumstances leading to those habeas cases never happened, and there is no way that Mike personally supports revocation of visas based on protected First Amendment speech. Mike was faced with an impossible situation and made what he considered the best choice under the circumstances, prioritizing preservation of his colleagues at the U.S. Attorney's Office while also avoiding further politicization of the cases if he had removed himself. Every day that passes, I feel lucky Mike said yes when I asked him to be my main advisor and confidant. And I'm even more thankful for the sake of Vermont and the U.S. Attorney's Office that Mike led the office over the incredibly difficult past year. None of it is to minimize the suffering imposed by the current administration on Ms. Ozturk and Mr. Madawi and many others. But under the circumstances, Mike made a reasonable and ethical choice out of a list of bad choices and subjugated himself to protect his colleagues and his office. Mike Drescher is the kind of public servant that we should all wish for and honor, and Mike is the kind of public servant that those of us outside federal government since last January 20th have been asking to stay. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on Mike's behalf. Long committed to the well-being of Vermont, I anticipate that Mike Drescher, if given the chance, will serve on the Vermont Supreme Court with tremendous dedication, distinction, and a deep commitment to equal justice under the law.
Thank you. We have a couple of minutes for any questions if there are any. Doesn't look like we have any questions for you. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, senators. I appreciate the opportunity.
Next up, we have Tristram Coppin, also on the Zoom.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to let me speak today in support of Mike Drescher's nomination to be a justice on the Vermont Supreme Court. I was a presidentially appointed U.S. attorney under President Obama. I also served as counsel to Senator Leahy on the Senate Judiciary Committee, where he worked on, among other things, judicial nominations. So I have a little experience with some of the questions you're weighing and judging. I've been essentially a lifelong Democrat. I share the concerns of many Vermonters about the Trump administration's challenges to some of the important underpinnings of our democracy and his use of the Justice Department as an instrument to undermine these institutions. We are a nation of immigrants. I know Mike from working with him from about 15 years, both as a fellow AUSA at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Vermont and while I was U.S. Attorney during the Obama administration. I can tell you that Mike is a person of character, integrity, and empathy. He is learned in the law. He has an excellent legal mind, capable of extremely high level and thoughtful legal analysis. He is a hard worker and pretty relentless when pursuing a factual or legal issue. He's a great communicator, an excellent speaker and writer. Most importantly, though, he is fair-minded. He is moderate. Mike is not an ideologue. In almost 15 years of working with him and spending a lot of time with him outside of work as well, I never heard him say or saw him do anything that was discriminatory, disrespectful, disdainful, or hurtful to another person or class of persons. He is by nature moderate, polite, civil. He is kind. Mike is well liked by his colleagues and opposing counsel, I think universally, and he's liked and respected by the federal judges that he appeared before and their office peers before. He has strong integrity and fealty to the rule of law and the need for government institutions, individuals, and judges to abide by the law. Those are the essential characteristics for the position to which he's been nominated. I know there are questions about Mike's role while serving as acting U.S. attorney on some immigration cases that came before the court. I do not have a lot of visibility into what happened in the U.S. Attorney's Office during the Trump administration, so I'm limited in some of the detailed presentations that some of the people who were in that office can provide. But I've read Mike's public statements about them, and I've thought about them a good deal. I will say that, one, the situation he was in was very difficult, to put it mildly. As head of the office, when asked to present the government's position in court on these cases, he did not have a number of palatable options, and I think Colo's cataloging of those, I think, is very detailed and very equivalent to how I view those as well. It is hard to second guess the choice he made to present the government's position in the cases and have the court rule on it, which he did fairly and honestly. Second, I read into some of the rationale for his thinking that he wanted to protect the office members from having to be in the hot seat in this decision-making role if he was not going to do it. He was thus expressing loyalty to his fellow AUSAs in this role, something that is a tradition of the office, an aspect of leadership that should be recognized, and a facet of the situation that made it more difficult and is a little invisible to people viewing it from the outside. Third, it is important to understand that this was not a role for the exercise of normal prosecutorial discretion, as I think it is commonly viewed by folks who are not as close to the situation. These were cases that where lawsuits had been filed, decisions had been made on arrest and detention and the nature of the immigration action that had taken against these individuals. Mike didn't have an option, to, practically speaking, to seek their release in defending the lawsuits. That call had been made it already. There were not a lot of good options. He was called upon to represent the agencies and litigate his position in court, and he did that honestly and fervently. Inclusion, as I say, for reasons separate from his role in these recent immigration cases, I think Mike would be an excellent Supreme Court justice. I also think his position in these cases and the options he took were complex and are difficult to judge. So I hope the committee looks beyond these issues to assess Mike's fitness to be confirmed. Like Owen Foster said, I think looking at the totality of his record and his character is what needs to happen, as opposed to actions in these very difficult circumstances being judged with hindsight. He's a fair-minded person. He is a moderate. He's not an ideologue. I really hope that ideological considerations don't drive decision-making of this committee, and I hope you'll be fair in assessing his nomination. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, committee. Any questions? Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Cobb.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We're a little bit ahead of schedule, so we have the floor at 11:30. Why don't we take a 10-minute break, come back, we'll start again at 10:10, and that will provide Mr. Drescher with about an hour and 15 minutes. Math isn't my strong suit, but close, a little over an hour, 45 minutes. Have a good day.
Yeah.